In this video, we will try and answer the question, what is public history? In order to understand what public history is, we need to first talk about what history is. And first of all, we need to emphasize that a simple definition of history is the study of change over time, right? The study of change over time. So for example, in the early 20th century, even though legally African Americans had many political rights, those rights were systematically denied them, right? But after World War II in the 50s and 60s, there were various civil rights movements and things like that that led to African Americans receiving the rights that they should have received a long time ago, right? What had been denied to them was more and more they were allowed to exercise those rights. So that's, you can study that, and you may study the civil rights movement or something like that in the 50s and 60s. Now, another part of what history does is then ask, why did that change happen, right? Why was it that African Americans were denied their rights for so many decades, but then in the 1950s and 60s, suddenly that you have these movements that are successful and lead to the restoration of those rights, right? So the historian will ask those questions, why did those changes happen? And a lot of times what historians will do then is to answer those questions, we will examine primary sources, right? We'll look at primary sources. And a primary source, remember, is something like an artifact, a document, a manuscript, letters, anything like that, any source of information that was created at the time under study. So if I'm studying the American Civil War and I'm looking at a letter written in 1863 by an American Civil War soldier, that is a primary source, right? That is a primary source. So keep that in mind. It's important to understand that primary sources, these documents, they were created at the time under study. Now also, and one thing I want to stress, if that Civil War soldier 20 years later was to write a book about his experience in the Civil War, that would also count as a primary source, provided that he's talking about what he himself saw or experienced. Right. So in that case, so you'd have to critically examine it in terms of memory, but that's a primary source. Now, and that's typically what historians do. That's how we understand why things changed over time. In addition, though, historians need to engage with secondary source material, right? These are things often written by other historians. So, for example, if I wanted to do the research on that Civil War soldier, I know that he fought the Battle of Gettysburg. I might read some books about the Battle of Gettysburg to learn about it and to see if what he says seems to match what's said there, or if it's different. And if he says something else, I need to figure out, oh, hey, was he just wrong, or is he telling us something about the battle that maybe we didn't know before? But we need to engage and be familiar with the secondary source material. And for those of you who have taken History 399 and will prepare to do so, this is often connected to historiography, which is a study about how people have changed their views over how to understand particular historic events. So in a sense, it's the history of history. Now, you will be expected as part of this for your museum project, you'll have to do an assignment where you collect primary and secondary sources. Now, also what historians do then, we take this material that we gain from primary sources and secondary sources, and we make an argument, right? So we're going to argue that things are the way they are, and that they got that way in a certain way, right? So we're going to argue that things are the way they are, and they got that way because of X, Y, or Z. So, for example, when I talk about the civil rights movement in world history, and why suddenly, African Americans had long been trying to obtain their civil rights. Why is it suddenly more successful in the 50s and 60s? And I argued, for example, the importance of Martin Luther King, of course, and his ideas of active nonviolence, and how he provokes these kinds of through his peaceful marches, he provokes violence against African Americans as they ask peacefully for their civil rights, and that leads to all this violence that is then televised. And that leads many Americans to say, hey, this is really bad, right? This is really wrong what's happening to the African Americans. We need to support them getting their civil rights. And one thing that made those Americans more receptive to those images and to saying, hey, we need to, African Americans should no longer be denied their civil rights, is the fact of the Cold War, that Americans were emphasizing, hey, we stand for freedom and equality and liberty against communism. And you can't emphasize freedom, equality, and liberty and then say, okay, but you African Americans, you don't get your rights. It's very difficult to do that during the Cold War. And so I just made an argument, right? I said those are three key reasons why that change happened in the way it did, right? And notice I emphasized particular historical events and people in making my argument, right? So historians, in essence, we study change over time. We study why those changes happen based on critical examination of primary sources and engagement with secondary sources. And then we use all that to make an argument, right? And to communicate a particular idea. So when you think of historians, you often think of academic history. You think of people like professors, like myself or Dr. Floyd or Dr. Witherspoon. And you think about what we do, right? We go into a classroom and we teach, and we write articles. We go to conferences and present our arguments, and then we publish them in journals or books, right? That's kind of what we do based on what I just talked about in terms of what history is. Now, what makes, and that's academic history, right? We're academics, we're scholars, we're professors. What makes, and we share a lot with people who are in the field of public history. So for example, they are dedicated to the historical method. They are dedicated to making sure, to talking about change over time, why those changes occurred, and basing that on solid historical evidence, right? So that's what we share. We can really, so we share a lot, right? That's a basic kind of ethos that we share. But there are some big differences, right? There's some key differences. So for example, as a professor, my audience, I basically have two audiences. One are students, right? People typically, not always, but typically people between the ages of 18 and 22 who are either history majors or who are people trying to fulfill a gen ed requirement, right? And they're in a sense there because they got to be there, right? They have to be there. So that's, you know, that's my audience, and that's a great audience. I love teaching, and I love our students. But it is a particular audience with its particular characteristics, and a lot of times they're forced to be there, right? My other audience are other professors, and these are usually specialists in my field, right? So, you know, for in my case, Korean history or historians of religion or something like that. And those are people I write articles for. And so, you know, I'll write this article, and maybe, you know, 20 or 30 people in the world will read it and be interested in it. And I'm actually a little optimistic about that. It's probably not even that many. But for a public historian, the audience is quite different. The audience can be of any age group. Anyone that can come into a museum from 5 to 105 might be their audience. And they often are there because they choose to be there. Right? They're not there because they have to. So the audience in many ways is more diverse. And in some ways the audience is more willing. Of course, you know, you have kids going on field trips and things like that. But that is a big difference. And related to that is a difference in location. Public historian, or, you know, as a professor, where do I go? I go to the classroom. I'm either in the classroom talking to students, teaching, I'm in the office, or I'm at a conference somewhere doing kind of the same thing, but the audience are professors. I spend a lot of time lecturing and leading discussions and things like that. But in public history, right, your location might be a national park, it might be a museum. You may make exhibits and almost never talk to the public, or you may be a living history interpreter who does nothing but talks to the public, right? So the location for public historians is much more diverse. In addition, there's a difference in terms of the degree of collaboration with others. Most of my work I do alone. I write articles largely alone. I teach largely alone. Sometimes I do engage in projects with other people, but it's usually a very loose kind of engagement, and where we pretty much just divide up tasks and just do them on our own. But public historians have to work with a huge number of diverse groups. Not only do public historians have to work with each other, you know, a museum will have multiple public historians working together on one exhibit, for example, but they have to work with people from the local neighborhood. They have to work with state officials to try and get funding. They have to work with a whole bunch of other people. So they have to be really good at collaborating with other people. Another key difference is in terms of terminal degrees. So, for example, usually most of your professors, especially history professors, we have a PhD, right? You know, so that took, for example, to get my PhD, because of the number of languages I had to learn, took 8 years. And that's fairly typical for a PhD. Some people take 10, right? So, you know, I did 4 years as an undergraduate, 2 years as a master's and then 8 years as a PhD. So it took me a long time to become qualified to be a professor. Usually public historians get like a master's degree. So they only have like a 2-year degree. They don't have a PhD typically. And some just have an undergraduate degree. And so we're different in that sense, right? In where we begin and end our education in a sense. This can lead to a certain kind of rivalry between us. Sometimes academic historians don't take public historians seriously because they aren't. They don't have as many years of formal study. Similarly, public historians sometimes look at us and say, oh, those people are irrelevant. They don't really talk to anyone. They don't really communicate their ideas well. And you can kind of see this, for example, in that Introduction to Public History book I mentioned in a previous lecture. You can kind of see that rivalry. You can see that in that book. But I think it's better to think of us as people who work together, right? So I'll go to conferences, for example, where public historians will present, and I learn a lot from them. And of course, public historians rely a lot on academic historians because we're doing research that they can then use in exhibits and so forth. So I think it's good to think of us as people who are share the same kind of ethos, but who work together in different ways. Now, one of the things that makes us really different are our career paths. If you're someone who pursues a PhD in history or history-related field, usually your goal is to become a professor, right, and teach history at a university level. And it's fairly simple career path. It's not simple to get there, but the way is pretty clear. It's just difficult to follow. For public historians, there's a lot of different opportunities in terms of what they can do. One new and growing field is digital history, which is using different kinds of technology to teach about history. So, for example, and I think this shows the kind of the relationship between public and academic history. One example that I'm a part of, or though I'm currently taking a break, is the New Books Network. Right. This is a kind of interesting group. This is if you type in New Books Network on Google, it will bring you to a website that has all these different interviews. And typically, what it is it's professors who are interviewing authors about their new books. And the idea is that you may not have time to read a book, but while you're driving, you might have time to listen to a podcast about the book. And wouldn't it be neat to listen to the author explain what their book is about? And I'm a host of one of those channels. Right, I did the New Books Network in Christian Studies channel. I was one of the hosts for that. And it's interesting because that network was started by a professor of Russian history who resigned his position, wanted to do something different, and focused on building up this network and is able to make a living at it. Now, that's kind of an exceptional example, but that shows you kind of an idea of digital history and the kind of career opportunities that exist with it. There's also things like community history, running local community centers of history, doing things like, like a house museum or something like that. That certainly does exist. Then there's the other kinds of museums ranging from small to big to gigantic, and we'll be spending a very long section on them. You also have archives. These are, and we'll talk more about archives later, but these are places that essentially preserve historical material. And you have people who focus on historic preservation and site management. So this would be something like taking care of historical houses or other buildings. And there's also tourism, right? Some people go to different locations, some of which don't actually have any original historical importance, but have been created to teach about history. And there's people who, do historical interpretation there and things like that. So there's a large number of careers about public history, and we'll have an assignment later that will help you to explore the possible career options that exist in that field. So public history is a relatively new field, and there's lots of opportunities and also some challenges that exist for people who are pursuing that field. The first thing, and this is, I'm going to focus on the good things first, is that people care a lot about history. I often will hear people tell me that they love history, but they don't particularly like learning in the classroom, right? And one thing that kind of makes me sad, but should be helpful for you who are interested in pursuing a career in public history, is that often museums are more trusted authorities than school teachers or professors. right? So people care about history, but they don't always trust teachers in terms of learning about history, right? They often are more interested in learning from museums or historical sites. So that's something that should make you happy, I suppose. It makes me sad. I wish people took, I hope people will listen to me. I've spent a lot of time studying this stuff. I hope I know what I'm talking about. I'm trustworthy. But in any case, people tend to trust museums more. And what's interesting is that, and I kind of talked about this in a previous video where I talked about skills versus knowledge. In a college classroom, you typically have a expert, the professor, getting up and lecturing, and then you have to learn all my stuff that I tell you, and then you give it back to me on an exam. Well, public history is a little bit different, right? What I just talked about is what we call banking knowledge, right? It's like I'm depositing knowledge in your brain, right? I mean, you still have to work hard to learn it, but the key thing is that I'm the one who's in a sense doing the activity. I'm the active person teaching. Students are more passive in their learning, though of course if you're an active learner you learn better. Well, as a public historian, you're more likely to help people do history, and that may seem really weird to say do history, but the idea is it emphasizes that people, when they go to a museum, when they go to a historic site, they're engaged in teaching themselves in a sense, right? They have the freedom to move around, to skip exhibits, to spend lots of time on one particular exhibit. And so they're, in a sense, in charge of their own learning. We call that free choice learning, right? And a lot of times you retain knowledge better in those circumstances. So it's kind of neat, right? When you make an exhibit, in many ways, you're going to be helping people learn and retain knowledge and shape how they understand history more so than I might, in teaching a student in a 3-hour course. You in that 1 hour in that museum, you may have more influence on them than I do in the 40 hours I teach the course. So that's something I think is really cool. What's also good about public history, I think that's an opportunity for many people, is it's more hands-on work. It's more something that you do with your hands. So, for example, as a professor, the primary thing I do is I talk and I write and I read. But if you are someone working in a museum, you're going to build stuff. You're going to paint stuff. You're going to design stuff. Right? It's a very kind of different skill set. So if you're one of these people, it's like, oh, I love teaching history. I love learning about history. But man, oh man, it's hard to sit through class. Well, public history may be something you'd be interested in, right? Especially if you're someone who brings together to these skills where, if you're kind of a handyman or handywoman, this is the right kind of place for you. There is also a lot of room for collaboration and working with the community. So if you're someone who likes working with teams, if you're someone who wants to be out there with the community doing something that feels really, really relevant, again, public history has a lot of great opportunities for you. But there's some challenges, right? And working with the community itself is a challenge. Convincing people that they should support you, that money should go to your museum is a challenge. And community members want to have an input in what you are going to be presenting. One thing about professors, we have a large degree of academic freedom, especially once we have tenure, to say and teach what we think is correct, so long as it's within our field of expertise. But for public historians, it's much more complicated. You can really, if you're not careful, cause a lot of controversy and alienate people. And we're going to look at some examples of people who really ran into trouble. And we'll actually devote a full week to studying controversy in public history and good ways to avoid controversy. But all that said, lots of opportunities out there for people who are interested in this field.